The skies over Europe in the early 1940s were filled with fire and fear. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, knowing that every mission could be their last. Germany's Luftwaffe dominated the air, flying sleek and deadly machines like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. These aircraft had proven themselves time and again, tearing into bomber formations, humiliating Allied fighters, and sending young men plummeting to the earth in twisted metal. It was in this brutal arena of war that the United States introduced a new fighter, one so large, so bulky, and so awkward-looking that German pilots laughed when they first saw it. They couldn't imagine that this overweight beast, the so-called Jug, would become one of the deadliest nightmares the Luftwaffe would ever face. That fighter was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. To understand why German pilots underestimated it, we need to go back to its origins. The P-47 wasn't sleek like the Spitfire, and it wasn't elegant like the Mustang. Instead, it was enormous, almost twice the size of many single-engine fighters of its day. Its fuselage was fat and round, earning it the nickname the Jug, short for Juggernaut. Some said it looked more like a flying milk bottle than a weapon of war. To most onlookers, especially those who admire the thin, aerodynamic lines of European fighters, the Thunderbolt seemed like a design destined to fail. After all, how could such a heavy machine stand a chance in a dogfight? But the engineers at Republic Aviation, led by the brilliant Alexander Kartveli, had something else in mind. They weren't building a dainty dueling plane for quick skirmishes. They were designing a machine that could take punishment, deliver destruction, and bring its pilot home alive. At its heart was a massive Pratt and Whitney R 2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that roared with more than 2,000 horsepower. It was the same engine that would later power the feared F-4U Corsair and the rugged Hellcat. With the Thunderbolt, this engine gave the aircraft extraordinary power, but also made it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. When the first squadrons of P-47s arrived in Europe in 1942, Luftwaffe pilots were unimpressed. Compared to the nimble Bf-109s and FW-190s, the Thunderbolt was slow to climb, heavy on the stick, and enormous in profile. German pilots joked that it was more target than threat. And to be fair, in the early days, those criticisms weren't entirely wrong. Many American pilots struggled to get the most out of the Jug. The aircraft wasn't built for tight turns or delicate maneuvering. It was like trying to dance in a suit of armor. Against a skilled German ace, a rookie Thunderbolt pilot could easily end up outmaneuvered and outgunned. Yet, appearances in war can be deceiving. What the Luftwaffe didn't realize was that the Thunderbolt's strength wasn't in agility. It was in resilience and firepower. Its thick armor and rugged construction allowed it to absorb punishment that would shatter lighter fighters. Pilots would later tell stories of coming home with wings shredded, engines coughing, and holes big enough to crawl through, yet still landing safely. This was no fragile beauty. It was a beast built to endure. And then, of course, there was the firepower. The P-47 carried 8 Browning .50 caliber M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each of those guns could spit out 850 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed a storm of lead capable of ripping through fighters, bombers, tanks, and even trains on the ground. A single burst from a Thunderbolt could shred a German fighter in an instant. Still, in 1942 and early 1943, the Thunderbolt was improving in combat. Pilots were still learning how to fight with it. The Germans remained confident, mocking the Jug as an oversized slug in the sky. But as the war dragged on, the P-47 would slowly reveal its true potential. The timing of its arrival couldn't have been more critical. The Allied bombing campaign was ramping up, sending waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into occupied Europe. These bombers could unleash devastation on factories, railways, and oil fields, but they were painfully vulnerable to German fighters. Entire formations were being torn apart by the Luftwaffe. The United States desperately needed a fighter that could escort the bombers, protect them from interceptors, and still bring its pilots home alive. At first, the Thunderbolt's limited range made this mission nearly impossible. It simply couldn't fly deep enough into Germany without running out of fuel. But gradually, With new drop tanks and improved tactics, the Jug began flying further and staying longer. And when it arrived above the bomber formations, the Luftwaffe quickly learned to stop laughing. Imagine being a German pilot in 1943. You dive onto a formation of B-17s, ready to rake their bellies with cannon fire, when suddenly a massive fighter drops from the clouds above you. Its wings flash with gunfire, and a wall of .50 caliber bullets rips through the air. Your aircraft shudders, controls go slack, and you realize too late that this clumsy beast has just turned the tables on you. The Thunderbolt's sheer firepower and diving speed were its hidden aces. Thanks to its powerful radial engine and weight, it could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. Pilots learned to use this to their advantage, swooping down on German planes and blasting them apart with devastating gun runs. Even if they missed, the Jug could simply dive away, shrugging off enemy fire as it went. For the Luftwaffe, it was a rude awakening. The fighter they had laughed at was now escorting bombers into the heart of Germany, shooting down their comrades, and proving itself nearly impossible to destroy. The laughter faded, replaced by respect and soon by fear. As the Allied air war intensified, the P-47's role grew beyond escort duty. It became a terror not just to German fighters, but to ground forces as well. Armed with bombs and rockets in addition to its machine guns, the Thunderbolt transformed into a flying tank killer. German convoys, armored columns, and supply lines soon found themselves under constant attack from the Jug's relentless firepower. But this deadly reputation was still building in the early years. In those first encounters, when the Luftwaffe still scoffed, the P-47's legend was just beginning. The stage was set for the Thunderbolt to prove itself, not just as a fighter, not just as an escort, but as one of the most versatile and devastating aircraft of the entire war. And the Germans, who once laughed at its bulk and its size, were about to learn the hard way what it meant to face 8.50 caliber machine guns pouring lead from the sky. By the summer of 1943, the laughter of the Luftwaffe had turned to unease. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a strange, overweight newcomer. It was becoming a familiar sight in the skies above occupied Europe. Its distinctive roar, a deep thunder from the 18 cylinders of the Pratt and Whitney R-2800, became a warning to German pilots and soldiers alike. Wherever the Jug appeared, destruction followed. The Thunderbolt's reputation began to spread not only because of its resilience, but also because of its evolving tactics. American pilots soon realized the Jug was not a knife-fighting plane like the nimble Spitfire. It was more like a heavyweight boxer, built to take hits, absorb punishment, and then deliver a crushing blow. The proper way to fly a P-47 was not to chase and twist in endless turns with German fighters, but to use its speed and firepower in quick, devastating strikes. One of the aircraft's greatest advantages was its ability to dive, thanks to its massive engine and rugged frame. The Thunderbolt could enter steep dives at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, faster than most German fighters dare to follow. Pilots developed boom and zoom tactics, climbing high above the enemy, diving in with overwhelming speed, firing a blistering burst from its 8.50 caliber guns, and then zooming back into the sky before the Germans could react. Over time, this hit-and-run style of combat became the Thunderbolt's signature move, frustrating German pilots who had expected to simply outmaneuver the bulky American machine. It wasn't long before the Jug's toughness became legendary. Stories circulated among Allied squadrons about P-47s limping home with wings shredded, tails nearly severed, or engines sputtering, yet still making it back across the channel. One famous case involved Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. In June 1943, he was attacked by German ace Egon Mayer. Johnson's P-47 absorbed dozens of cannon and machine gun hits. His canopy jammed shut, and hydraulic fluid sprayed across his cockpit. Mayer made pass after pass, convinced the Thunderbolt would finally break apart. But it didn't. Johnson survived, and when he finally landed, ground crews counted over 200 holes in his aircraft. The Jug had taken a beating that would have destroyed almost any other fighter, and still brought its pilot home alive. To the Luftwaffe, this resilience was maddening. The Thunderbolt's radial engine, in particular, made it harder to kill. Unlike inline engines, such as those in the Messerschmitts, a radio could take significant damage and continue running. A single bullet to the radiator could doom a German Bf 109. The P-47 had no radiator to puncture. Even when its cylinders were damaged, it often kept flying long enough to reach safety. But the P-47 was not just a survivor, it was a killer. Its 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns were devastating, not only to aircraft, but to anything unfortunate enough to be caught below. Pilots joked that firing all 8 guns at once felt like sawing the wings off the enemy. A 1-second burst unleashed nearly 150 rounds, enough to shred most German planes in midair. Against lightly armored targets on the ground, trucks, locomotives, even tanks, the combined firepower could be catastrophic. And soon, that became one of the Jug's defining roles. As the Allies advanced deeper into occupied Europe, the Thunderbolt shifted from air superiority missions to ground attack. It could carry bombs, rockets, and extra-fuel tanks, making it one of the most versatile aircraft in the Allied arsenal. German troops nicknamed it the J-bow, short for Jag bomber or fighter bomber, and they learned to fear its silhouette in the sky. Convoys scattered when P-47s appeared overhead. Armored columns, so confident in their steel plating, found themselves ripped apart by rockets and bombs. Even railway lines and supply depots were not safe. The Jug became a flying hammer, smashing the logistical backbone of the German war machine. Still, its duels with the Luftwaffe remain the most dramatic chapters of its story. At first, the German fighters continued to test the P-47, hoping to exploit its weaknesses. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 could outclimb it in short bursts. The Focke-Wulf 190 could outturn it in tight engagements. But as American pilots gained experience, they turned these disadvantages into traps. Instead of turning or climbing with their opponents, they played to the Jug's strengths, its speed in a dive, its high-altitude performance, and its brutal firepower. This shift in tactics produced deadly results. By 1944, the P-47 groups in Europe were claiming thousands of German aircraft destroyed. Some fighter groups, like the famous 56th under Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, became legends in their own right. Zemke himself trained his pilots to use altitude and teamwork to exploit the Thunderbolt's advantages, and soon his group became one of the highest-scoring units in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. But perhaps the most fascinating twist in the Thunderbolt story was how it changed the balance of the air war through persistence. The Luftwaffe had trained its pilots to fight against fast, fragile opponents, rely on agility and quick kills. The P-47 didn't play by those rules. It refused to die easily. It refused to be intimidated. And with every mission, the German pilots found themselves not just battling the aircraft, but battling fatigue and frustration. The psychological effect was enormous. Imagine diving onto what you think is a slow, ungainly target, only to watch it streak away in a dive, then come screaming back down at you with 8 guns blazing. Imagine emptying your cannons into its fuselage, certain you've scored a kill, only for the Thunderbolt to continue flying, its pilot grinning behind bullet-spattered glass. Slowly but surely, the P-47 broke the Luftwaffe's confidence. By late 1944, with long-range drop tanks fitted, the Jug was flying deeper into Germany, escorting bombers on missions the Germans had once thought untouchable. And on the ground, it was inflicting devastating losses on German industry and supply chains. Even when newer, sleeker fighters like the P-51 Mustang arrived to steal the spotlight, the P-47 remained indispensable. In fact, while the Mustang carried the glamour of long-range escort, the Thunderbolt racked up staggering ground attack tallies. By the end of the war, P-47s had destroyed thousands of aircraft in the air, tens of thousands of vehicles on the ground, and even hundreds of tanks. It was not the pretty fighter. It was not the graceful one. But it was the fighter that got the job done. And the pilots who flew it, men like Johnson, Zemke, Francis, Gabby, Gabreski, and many others, became living legends, proving that what mattered most in combat was not looks, but performance. For the German pilots who once mocked the Jug, the joke had backfired. What they dismissed as an overweight slug had become one of the deadliest predators in the skies. The laughter of 1942 had turned into grim silence by 1944, as more and more Luftwaffe aircraft fell in flames under the relentless hail of .50 caliber bullets. But the true climax of the Thunderbolt story was yet to come. In the final year of the war, as the Allies closed in on Germany, the Jug would unleash its full fury, not only on enemy fighters, but on every factory, every train, every convoy that kept the Nazi war machine alive. It was then that the Luftwaffe, already weakened and outnumbered, would discover just how unstoppable the so-called Flying Jug could be. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was bleeding. German aces still fought with skill and ferocity, but their numbers dwindled, their fuel supplies ran thin, and their aircraft factories faced relentless Allied bombing. Into this crumbling battlefield, the P-47 Thunderbolt entered its most fearsome chapter. No longer just a fighter escort, no longer just a heavy bruiser. Now it was a hammer that smashed the German war machine into pieces. Everywhere the Wehrmacht moved, the Jug followed. When German tanks rolled toward the front, P-47 swooped down, unleashing rockets and bombs, then finishing off survivors with streams of .50 caliber fire. When trains snaked across the countryside carrying supplies, the Thunderbolt appeared overhead, raking them until boilers exploded in white plumes of steam. Even German soldiers marching down roads came to fear the thunderous growl of the R-2800 engine above, because they knew it meant death was seconds away. The Jug had become a symbol of inevitable destruction, the sound of Allied dominance roaring from the sky. But the Jug's reign was not only about terror from above. It was about victory bought through persistence. The Luftwaffe tried to resist, throwing up flak, scrambling interceptors, doing everything possible to hold the line. Yet time after time, the Thunderbolt shrugged it off. Pilots told stories of flying home with wings perforated, fuel tanks shot through, tails hanging by a thread, and yet the Jug refused to fall. Its toughness was not just a statistic in a manual. It was the difference between life and death for hundreds of airmen. One of the most remarkable demonstrations of the Jug's power came during the Allied push after D-Day. In June 1944, as American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the P-47 became their guardian angel. While German artillery and tanks threatened to push the invasion back into the sea, Thunderbolts roared overhead, hammering enemy positions again and again. In one 48-hour period, Thunderbolt squadrons flew hundreds of sorties, destroying tanks, bunkers, and convoys, clearing the way for ground troops to advance. Eisenhower himself credited the fighter bombers with crippling the German ability to counterattack. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets marveled at the Jug's durability when Lend-Lease P-47s arrived. Soviet pilots, accustomed to flying nimble but fragile aircraft, were astonished at how much punishment the American fighter could endure. Though it never played as large a role in the East as in the West, its reputation spread across every theater where it served. And then there were the aces who carved their names into history from the cockpit of a Jug. Francis Gabby Gabreski, the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater, claimed most of his 28 kills in AP-47. Hubert Hub Zemke, the leader who turned the 56 Fighter Group into one of the deadliest air units of the war, perfected tactics that made the Jug unbeatable at high altitude. Even Chuck Yeager, the man who would later break the sound barrier, flew P-47s early in his career, calling a rugged, dependable machine that taught him how to fight and survive. But perhaps the most dramatic proof of the Jug's might came from the German pilots themselves. By late 1944, the laughter had long stopped. Instead, Luftwaffe veterans spoke with respect and often dread about the Thunderbolt. They knew it could dive faster than they could follow, fire harder than they could withstand, and survive punishment their own machines never could. To be caught beneath one, whether in a cockpit or in a convoy, was a death sentence. The Jug had gone from punchline to predator in just 2 years. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, the Thunderbolt's ground attack role became its crowning legacy. It wasn't glamorous dogfights that defined its final year. It was sheer methodical destruction. In the months after D-Day, P-47s destroyed over 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 rail cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles. German infrastructure collapsed under this aerial sledgehammer. Factories couldn't get raw materials. Troops couldn't get supplies, and tanks couldn't reach the front. The Luftwaffe, once proud and feared, found itself helpless against the relentless pounding. Yet through all this devastation, there remained something almost poetic about the Jug. It was a fighter that wasn't supposed to succeed. Too big, too heavy, too ungainly, too odd. But war has a way of proving appearances wrong. The P-47 wasn't a pretty fighter. It wasn't the elegant duelist. It was the brute force of industry and engineering turned into wings of steel. It was proof that survival, firepower, and persistence mattered more than beauty. By the end of the war, the numbers spoke for themselves. P-47 pilots had destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands more targets on the ground. The Jug had become one of the most produced fighters of the conflict, with over 15,000 built. It served not only the United States, but also Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations. It had proven itself across Europe, in the Mediterranean, and even in the Pacific, where its toughness and firepower continued to earn respect. And perhaps the greatest testament came from the men who flew it. Many who transitioned to sleeker planes, like the P-51 Mustang, still spoke fondly of the Jug. They called it a friend, a guardian, a machine that gave them a fighting chance when everything else seemed stacked against them. To the ground troops who watched it tear apart enemy tanks, it was a savior. To the civilians who heard its thunder overhead, it was the sound of liberation. For the Germans, though, the P-47 was a bitter lesson. The fighter they mocked, the ungainly milk bottle in the sky, became the executioner of their dreams of air superiority. They laughed at it in 1942. By 1945, they prayed not to see it. As the war ended and peace returned, the Jug story faded behind the glamorous shadow of the Mustang, the Spitfire, and the jet age that followed. But history remembers more than just sleek silhouettes. History remembers what wins wars. And the Thunderbolt, heavy, loud, and merciless, did exactly that. The laughter of the Luftwaffe echoes, now only in memory. What remains is the roar of the R, 2800, the blaze of 8.50 caliber guns, and the story of a fighter that turned ridicule into fear, and fear into victory. The P-47 Thunderbolt, mocked at first sight, revered at last, earned its place not just as a plane, but as a legend.